Greetings, IB history students. The last time we talked about nationalism and how Napoleon I had made French people realize that it's pretty cool to dominate Europe. The problem with nationalism, it's much different than patriotism, is that it creates conflict. It leads to countries breaking agreements, whether it be trade agreements or uh, peace agreements, for example, and it put countries eventually into conflict with one another. One other thing that Napoleon spreads throughout Europe, and he's certainly not the only reason why this ideology spreads, is something known as classical liberalism. Liberalism is a much misunderstood concept, and you're going to read about this in the project. But classical liberalism, or 19th century liberalism, revolves around two major topics. One is the idea of civil liberties. If we think about Napoleon, Napoleon in 1804 put forth his Napoleonic Code. And in that code, he wanted to, and let's see if I can move this, he wanted to basically reflect some of the changes that had been made in the French Revolution. He wanted people, for example, to be promoted based on merit and not on birthright. He believed that all people should be able to own land, which was a major change in history. Uh, it was in large part influenced by what had taken place in the United States. Classical liberals believed in a written constitution. It's what the Americans received in 1789. In our First Amendment, the rights to free speech and a free press and free religion are all promoted by this ideology of classical liberalism. Napoleon, for example, ended the persecution of religious minorities, giving rights to Jewish citizens and Protestants because France was predominantly Catholic. Uh, Classical liberalism, as you'll read, is influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century philosopher. He believed they had a simple slogan of life, liberty, and property. He believed that everybody, regardless of wealth, should have the right or the ability to own property. And classical liberals don't necessarily believe in universal voting, but they do believe in giving people opportunities. The other part of classical liberalism is the ideas put forth by Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations on economics. Adam Smith is known as the father of capitalism and introduced this idea of creating free markets based upon simple principles like prices are determined by supply and demand, that competition should be encouraged, that people are motivated mostly by self interest. And the big thing related to economics that classical liberals believed in is land ownership. That people who had been kept from owning property because of birthright, classical liberals believed they had or should have the opportunity to own land. And that's the biggest difference uh, in what was happening at the time in Europe and what classical liberals were promising. The one thing that classical liberals agreed with all reformers is the idea that countries should have a written constitution for its people. Maybe they disagreed on who could vote or who had power, but a written constitution and the ability to own land were consistent.